It's that time again. Time to enter the incredible world of the paranormal. And tonight, I want to tell you a strange and disturbing story, but true nevertheless. It concerns a small village in, well, it's best if I don't say exactly where. Let's just say it's in our region. Anyway, my story concerns a young couple who visited the village some 10 years ago, and as it was getting late, decided to see if they could get a room at the local inn. They were a perfectly ordinary couple, newly married and taking their honeymoon by driving around the byways of the county through the lesser-known places well off the tourist map. Quite by chance, they came across this particular village. It wasn't marked on their map, but that didn't surprise them, as it was so small it probably wouldn't have been big enough to register on anything but a large-scale chart. Anyway, as I said, it was getting late, and they had the choice of carrying on to the next large town to find accommodation, or see if the local inn had rooms. Now, the village consisted of one main street containing a few cottages and 2 pubs. And the couple stopped at the first pub they saw and went inside. The interior was everything you would expect from a small local inn. The rooms were quite low, with exposed oak beams spanning the ceiling. There were 2 rooms downstairs, both quite small, and the bar ran through both of them. A few locals sat at the tables, some playing dominoes, some just staring silently into the flames coming from the open fire. The man went to the bar and was greeted quite warmly by the landlord. He asked for a drink for his wife and himself, and when they had been served, he asked the landlord if he had any rooms where they could stay for the night. The landlord looked at the man for a moment and then said that he had a couple of rooms which he kept for emergencies, and they could have one of them if they wanted. Naturally, they said yes and asked to see the rooms. So the landlord took them upstairs. When they saw them, they were enchanted. The rooms looked as if they'd been lifted straight from the 18th century. They chose the bigger of the 2 rooms and went downstairs to the bar again. After a wonderful home-cooked meal which the landlord's wife prepared for them, they took their leave and went upstairs to bed. At about 12:30, the couple settled down to go to sleep. But it was not forthcoming. For some strange reason, they both found it impossible to drop off. After tossing and turning for a while, the man leaned over and switched on the bedside light. His new wife was also awake, and she asked him what the matter was. At first, all he would say was that he couldn't get to sleep, and his wife said the same thing. But they both knew that there was another reason for being unable to sleep. After a while, the husband suddenly said that they should really be honest with each other. And then he told his wife that he couldn't get to sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he got a vivid picture of a vicious-looking man standing at the foot of the bed, staring at them. To his surprise, his wife told him that the same thing was happening to her. They lay there musing over why they should both be suffering from the same nightmare. And after a while, they decided it was time to try to get to sleep again. But as the husband leant over to turn off the light, he was stopped short by his wife stifling a scream. He looked at her and saw that she was staring at the foot of the bed. Well, naturally, his gaze followed hers, and what he saw made him more frightened than he had ever been in his whole life. For there, standing at the foot of the bed, was the same man that they had both seen when they had closed their eyes. He was about 6 feet tall, dressed in a knee-length waisted coat, which looked as if it was made from dark red velvet. The collar was wide and seemed to stand up against his neck. He was wearing a long white periwig, and hanging at his side was an ornate sword. In his left hand, he carried a long, black whip. The couple were too frightened to speak, until the husband felt that he had to show that he could protect his new wife, and so he addressed the figure. He asked him who he was and what he was doing in their room. But the figure didn't reply. It just stood there, glaring at them. The very act of speaking gave the man some courage, so he asked the figure again the same question. And again, there was no reply. So the man began to get out of bed. As he swung his legs out of bed, the figure suddenly raised its left arm and pointed the whip at him. At the same time, the man felt a stinging pain across his arms, as if he'd actually been struck with the whip, although neither of them saw it move. He cried out in pain, and this seemed to inflame the figure. It opened its mouth, and the couple both heard a terrifying sound. It was like a wild animal roaring in pain. It seemed to penetrate the very core of their brains, causing them to clap their hands over their ears. But the sound wouldn't go away. And then it was joined by a new sound. The cries of a child or children in agony. It was getting to the point that the couple couldn't stand anymore. But to their horror, their ordeal wasn't over. From out of nowhere, they suddenly saw two more figures. They were two small children, dressed in rags, standing just in front of the man. They were weeping bitterly and holding their hands out in a sort of plea for mercy. The figure seemed to notice them for the first time, and without warning, suddenly turned on them and began to beat them mercilessly. Well, this was too much for the couple. Even though they doubted the evidence of their own senses, the apparition was too real to be ignored. The man leapt off the bed and sprung towards the man. Just before he could grab his arm, the one with the whip in it, the man turned his attention to him, and he was struck a swinging blow across the face which sent him flying. The wife then leapt out of bed, but found that she could not move beyond where she stood. Her legs seemed like lead. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The figures of the two children just disappeared before their eyes, and the figure of the man looked at the couple with a malevolence you could almost touch. And then it also faded slowly from sight, leaving a deep sense of depression and fear in the room. The couple were exhausted, and when they'd recovered, they decided that they couldn't stay a moment longer in the pub. So they hurriedly dressed, packed their suitcase, and went downstairs. They debated whether to wake the landlord and his wife, slightly surprised that they hadn't already been woken by the noise, and tell them that they were leaving. But eventually, they thought that the main thing was just to get out of the building. So they left a short note apologizing for leaving so abruptly, and some money to cover the cost of the room and meal. They then let themselves out of the front door, which they noted afterwards was not locked, and got into their car and drove off into the night. A couple of days later, they'd calmed down and had come to the conclusion that they'd both had a vivid nightmare, and that what they had thought they had seen was only their imagination. There didn't seem to be any other explanation. Feeling slightly foolish, but more concerned that they go back and settle up any differences of money that they might owe the landlord, they went back to the village. But to their surprise, they couldn't find it. It was as if it had disappeared from the face of the earth. They stopped at a police station near to where they thought the village should be and asked for directions. And the policeman told them that there was no such village by the name that they had said. But when he was pressed, he told them that a village of a similar name had once existed up until the late 18th century. But it had been razed from the map when the lord of the manor, who was renowned for his violent temper and cruelty, had been discovered indulging in unnatural practices, and the local magistrates had tried to arrest him. He had refused to recognize that he was subject to the law as much as his tenants, and one night had set fire to the houses in the village, burning them all to the ground. In the process, he had perished in the flames. And thereafter, the site was supposed to be haunted. Over the years, it had become overgrown and was now lost in the trees and shrubbery which had taken root. To this day, the couple swear that what they experienced was real. And to this day, they have never been able to find that village again. Ah, but you might ask, Why do the couple swear that what they experienced was real when they had decided that it was their imagination after they had left on that fateful night? Well, it's simple, really. Where the man had been hit across the face with the whip, there is now a white scar bearing the pattern of woven leather.